They were the first to respond to the good news of the gospel. They were the first to build churches and cathedrals to God's glory. They were the first to venerate the holy places of Christ's birth, crucifixion, and resurrection. Yet today they are often forgotten by their fellow Catholics throughout the world as they have to live in an increasingly non-Christian environment. I speak of the Christians in the Middle East. We will be looking to their history and their current situation in this episode of the St. Charles Forum.
Word Television Network presents the St. Charles Forum from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Welcome to the St. Charles Forum as we look to our fellow Christians in the Holy Lands and the Middle East, and we're very privileged to have with us today, first of all, Msgr. Robert Stern, General Secretary of the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. Msgr., welcome.
Thank you, John.
And also a Chorbishop, an auxiliary bishop, Msgr. John Faris, who is Vicar General of the Maronite Eparchy of St. Maron in Brooklyn. Welcome, Msgr.
Thank you very much.
Now, most of the Catholics in the United States, probably most of our viewers, are Roman Catholics. And when they say Catholic, that's what they think of. Msgr., are there other kinds of Catholics in the world?
Well, one of the insights given to us by the Vatican Council regarding the Church is that the Church is much larger than the Catholic Church. Another insight given was that the Catholic Church itself is comprised of 22 Catholic churches, each to different degrees autonomous and able to govern themselves. Now, 21 of these churches are Eastern. The 22nd is the Latin Church, the predominant majority.
So most of our viewers are Roman Catholics and are familiar with the 22nd, as you put it, of the Catholic churches.
Yes, precisely.
And the Holy Father, though, the Bishop of Rome, is the chief shepherd of all of these churches.
As successor to Peter, he is the head, the universal pastor, and all of these 22 churches, the bishops and the faithful in them, are all subject to his authority. Because we are in communion with him, we're also in communion with each other.
Okay, so he's, in a sense, the principle of communion, the source of union and communion
yes.
among all those Catholics.
Yes.
His title relating to the Western Church is rarely used, but he's called the Patriarch of the West.
Oh, and that's one of the titles that the Pope has.
That's one of his titles, which refers to that he's the head of the Latin or Roman Church.
I see. Mm-hmm.
As opposed to the universal head of the Church.
And the Supreme Pontiff, I suppose, would refer to his overall position.
Yes.
Exactly.
Msgr. Faris, you're a Maronite.
Yes.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit, that's one of the 21.
I'm one of the 21, yes. Our church centered in Antioch, which is now found in Turkey, and very small Christian presence there today. And near Antioch, a monk named Maron, who lived in the middle of the 4th century, towards the end of the 4th he died. After his death, the monks built a large monastery in his honor. That monastery, during the middle of the 5th century, when there was a controversy over one or two natures of Christ, the Council of Chalcedon said there were two natures, defining Christ's personality in that way.
And that's what we believe. We all believe that as Catholics.
All Catholics believe. Mm-hmm. These monks and this community had gathered around the monastery, stayed aligned with the Catholic Church, and defended that Chalcedonian doctrine.
And who were the ones that didn't?
They would be known as Monophysites. Mm-hmm. Many people in Armenia, in parts of Syria, in parts of Egypt, all broke communion with Rome over this issue. Now, and the Maronites remained faithful. The Maronites remained faithful. Now, we portray this issue as a religious doctrinal dispute, but in many ways it was a political, social, and economic problem with only a religious or doctrinal veneer. that tore the church apart.
Well, but there clearly is a difference, though, between the Monophysite position saying that there's just one nature in Christ and the Catholic true position that there's both a divine and human nature.
But we have now, fortunately, with many of these churches, the Holy Father has signed common declarations regarding Christology, showing that it was a terminological issue more than a substantial issue.
So sometimes there really wasn't disagreement, but it looked like there was because of the language that was being used.
Yes.
Monsignor Stern, the faith started in the Holy Lands, in the Middle East. They were the first ones, as we were saying, to build the churches, to sing hymns of praise to God. Are they a dominant presence now in the Middle East? How many in the Holy Lands, let's say, what would you say would be the percentage of Christians that are there now?
Christians have just about disappeared in the Holy Land. Right now, if you count Israel and the occupied territories in Palestine, what traditionally we call the Holy Land, there's probably a population of getting close to 7 million people, and Christians of all branches of the church together are probably no more than 165,000.
My, of all the churches.
All together. Maybe roughly a third of them are Greek Orthodox. Roughly another third are Latin Catholics. The other third would be Greek Catholic, and then some of the smaller denominations.
Is this unusual in the history of the Holy Lands? Is the Christian population at a low point now, or have there been times when it's been that bad in the past?
Well, I think it's at a low point for a couple of reasons. First, because of the massive growth of the Jewish population in the Holy Land, and also because of the exodus of the Christians. For social reasons, economic reasons, Christians, especially from the Holy Land, but from all the Middle East, are heading to the Western countries, Australia, South America, Canada, United States. For example, there are more Christians from Bethlehem in Chile than there are in Bethlehem right now.
Really? That's incredible. Now, what rite would they belong to, or which church would they belong to?
They would be
mostly
Greek Catholic, Greek Orthodox, and Latin Catholic or Roman Catholic.
Now, of course, Bethlehem was the place of our Lord's birth, and it's now in Palestinian hands, right?
It is, yes.
Before it had been
just a couple of days before Christmas last year, it was turned over to the Palestinian Authority.
And are there Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Catholics that are involved in government there?
Yeah, actually, considering the small number of Christians in the Palestinian community, they have a pretty good influence in the Palestinian Authority leadership roles. They've traditionally had that always. And President Yasser Arafat, at least from the religious point of view, is constantly saying Christians and Muslims together must work for the future of Palestine. So he's always making reference to a role for the Christians.
Oh, really?
And of course, Christians in the Middle East are Arabs, which most people don't think of. They sort of think, well, Arab means Muslim. But the Christians of the Holy Land, of course, are Arab Christians.
And will wear the Arab headdress and speak Arabic?
And certainly speak Arabic.
I think an interesting...
Monsignor I guess his native language or family language would be Arabic.
Would be Arabic. And I think it was in your periodical, The Catholic Near East, that you emphasized that in the Middle East, Christians also call God Allah.
Oh, that's interesting.
And interesting.
I didn't know that myself. Yeah.
It is important to remember that God is being worshipped and glorified in Arabic, and that Arabic is not specifically or exclusively an Islamic language, but also can be a Christian language.
And indeed, we're saying God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is being glorified in Arabic.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Monsignor Faris, your family must have left the Middle East at some point.
Yes.
What led them to leave?
Well, when they left, the territory was still under Ottoman Turkish control at the turn of the century, which was the first major exodus in modern times of Christians from the Middle East. They left at the turn of the century and would have all had Turkish passports, because at the time Lebanon was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and left because of there was famine, there was economic problems, and political disturbances. There were persecutions. So a lot of Christians, a great many left. From 1890 was when the exodus started from the Middle East.
And it's been going on ever since, I guess.
Well, there was one again in the late 40s, subsequent to the Arab-Israeli conflicts, and again in Lebanon specifically in 75 when the civil war erupted again.
So mostly Christians have been leaving just because it's been so dangerous.
It's been difficult to find jobs, it's been difficult to find food at times.
And the Christians are more likely to find it easier to leave, first because the Western countries are traditionally Christian.
Can
They
receive
have so
them.
many relatives there already. And also, from many points of view, the Christians tend to be historically perhaps somewhat better educated, somewhat more upwardly mobile because of, again, the connections to the West and the assistance they receive from the
So
West.
they would more easily be able to get out. I mean, they might have a skill that a Western country would be very happy to have them and
right.
receive them.
They were educated in missionary schools, etc., so they had a high level of education. But the difficulty is perhaps we've made it so attractive to leave that now, as you alluded a few times, in the Middle East there's a danger that in the land where our Lord himself walked, his name might not be praised.
Yes, that would be tragic. Now, the Maronites, Msgr. Faris, you were pointing out, have always been faithful to Rome and always been in communion with Rome. But Msgr. Stern, there are others, aren't there, who are now one of these 21 other churches in the Latin Church, which had not always been in communion with Rome. What would be some examples of some of them?
Well, most of the other Eastern Catholic churches are the result of a movement of reunion in the Orthodox churches of the East.
Why would there have to have been a reunion? What happened that they wouldn't have been in union with Rome?
Well, as Msgr. Faris pointed out, in the early centuries, because of theological controversies and sometimes political factors, branches of the church got, how would you say, cold relations one with the other, or sometimes criticized one another's practices or beliefs. And so that was the beginning of what we always called the schisms of the church. And in later centuries, there were always portions within those separated communities that were looking for reunion. In those days, they conceived of reunion as a sort of return to Rome. Now, the union of the churches is conceived of in a different way, more as sister churches gradually coming together in mutual respect.
Mm-hmm. And the Holy Father even talks about the church having to breathe with both lungs, right? I mean, in the sense,
That's right.
The lung in the West and the lung in the East.
The Holy Father this is probably one of his greatest priorities right now, is the union of the Eastern churches.
Now, we don't have much time left in this segment, but Msgr. Faris, you're a historian as well. There was something that occurred shortly after we moved into the second millennium that was a major split within the church.
Yes, in Constantinople, we usually attribute 1054 as the break-off period, when the schism began, to a specific date, in fact, when there was a mutual excommunication. That is kind of anachronistic, because there had been a parting of ways for some time.
This is between the church that was in the Eastern Empire,
Exactly.
around Byzantium, and then
Rome.
the church that was in the West.
And the church that was in the West. And as Monsignor said, after the 11th century, most of the East was Orthodox or non-Catholic. There were very few exceptions. In fact, in the Middle East, the Maronites were the only exception. Union started to occur again in the 16th century, after the Council of Trent, when the missionaries went to these territories, started educating the people, and naturally these people were attracted to Catholicism.
And so a number of these people then came back into union with the Holy See.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we'll explore this fascinating topic when we come back from this break.
We'll return in just a moment.
Welcome back to the St. Charles Forum and our fascinating discussion of the Eastern churches, the Eastern Christians. Msgr. Faris, you are a Chorbishop of the Eparchy of St. Maron. Now, there just might be one or two viewers out there that don't know what a Chorbishop is or what an eparchy is. Could you enlighten us?
You may be surprised. You're not the first person to ask me that. Chorbishop, the word chora in Greek means country. So these were the bishops of the countryside. and were the pastors of the communities not attached to the city. As the office evolved, it became an honorific office in the Maronite Church and is conferred by a bishop upon certain, it would be a recognition of certain accomplishments, mediocre as they may be, but it is also conferred with the laying on of hands. And I'm given the ability to also confer ordination on subdeacons and minor orders, which we still have in the Maronite Church. An eparchy is...
Now, in the West, in the Latin Church, we have auxiliary bishops. Are you similar to an auxiliary bishop?
No, because an auxiliary bishop is assigned a titular see.
Okay.
A chorbishop is not even assigned a titular see.
Okay. Now, it really can get complicated, these things in the church, but a titular see means a piece of land or jurisdiction, right? I mean, a bishop always supposed to have some kind of
some kind of a church, yes.
Yeah.
And a chorbishop is attached to the bishop of that see.
I see, okay. And an eparchy?
Is identical to a diocese. There's no difference. It's another Eastern term for diocese.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. That was very enlightening. Msgr Stern, where's the largest concentration of Christians in the East?
Taking East in a very broad sense, probably the single largest number.
Well, maybe I should say the Near East.
The Near East. Well, actually, Egypt. There's more Christians in Egypt than in all the rest of the Middle East put together. Mm-hmm. Probably 6 or 7 million, mostly Coptic Orthodox.
Uh-huh. And are there Catholic Christians there as well?
Yeah, there's a one of those 22 churches is the Coptic Catholic Church, but it's very tiny.
Oh, now these would have been Copts that's C-O-P-T-S, right? These would have been Coptic Christians or Egyptian Christians that would have come back into union or communion with the Holy See.
That's right, and where the Holy See set up a separate parallel jurisdiction for the Coptic Christians that were in full union with the Holy See.
And where would be the next largest concentration?
In the Middle East?
Yes.
Well, in the immediate Middle East, probably Lebanon would be next, and then there's Iraq.
Oh.
Then Syria, in the Middle Eastern countries.
I was just recently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and they had beautiful, beautiful chalices and thuribles and other sacred vessels that had recently been discovered in northern Syria, which had been buried at the time of the Islamic advance and were just discovered not too long ago. But they were buried to protect them from the Islamic advance, and then of course the whole region became Muslim.
That's right.
And but one of the things I thought was so interesting, they said it must have been an incredibly thriving Christian community because of the beauty and costliness of these vessels, and how big the bowl was of the chalices because the people received the precious blood, and it indicated that they were very, very large congregations.
Some people don't realize that before the 7th century, before the coming of Islam, the whole entire area was Christian. You might go just outside of Amman, Jordan, for example, and so many little towns used to be bishops' sees and ruins of dozens and dozens of churches, all dating back to the pre-Islamic times.
Mm-hmm. So the whole region was Christian at one time.
Totally Christian.
Mm-hmm. And then
Arab invaders. There was an Arab Islamic invasion beginning in about 632 and finishing around the end of the 7th century.
But it must have been massive and rapid.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Msgr Stern, we've mentioned at other times, he was saying East in the very broad sense of the term. From the Middle East, from Persia, missionaries, Christian missionaries, they say that the gospel was taken on the back of the mules of missionaries to China, Mongolia, to Southwest India. And it's in Southwest India that perhaps the most vibrant Eastern Catholic Church in the world exists today, the Syro-Malabar Church.
In India?
In India, Southwest India. And this church takes pride in the fact that it was evangelized by the Apostle St. Thomas. The entire community refers to itself as St. Thomas Christians.
Oh, so they trace their lineage just as a group of Catholics in India, and they trace their lineage all the way back to St. Thomas.
You know what, for me, is very fascinating. We grow up with the story of how the church spread in the Roman Empire, because that's the Acts of the Apostles and the narrative St. Luke gave us. He wanted to show how Christianity went from the very fringe of the empire right to the capital itself. But there was another story, which is the growth of Christianity in the Persian Empire and outside it, which generally we know much less about. But it worked the same way. Like in the Acts of the Apostles, you read how St. Paul would go to different towns, and he'd go first to the Jewish communities and preach there. And if they accepted the good news, fine. Otherwise, he went to the Gentiles. Well, with
that order, Jews first and then the Gentiles.
Well, St. Thomas, for example, there are 7 churches in southwest India and the Malabar coast, which are traditionally called the churches founded by Thomas. 6 of them had Jewish trading posts, and one of them was right near a 7th Jewish trading post, because before the Islamic times, there was a tremendous amount of commerce to the Middle East and India. So it's interesting that probably St. Thomas was exactly like St. Paul, went to these Jewish communities because he was a Jew, preached to them, and then preached to the local folk.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And they've been there all this time.
All this time, unbroken descent from the first century.
And of course, I suppose, Westerners forgot about them, I suppose, right?
They really did, because Islam came as a great divider between the West and India. And when the Portuguese and then Spanish missionaries arrived,
in the 16th century.
In the 16th century, and they found these Christians there. St. Francis Xavier, one of his letters to St. Ignatius Loyola, refers to these Eastern Christians he found. But they came from the world of the Reformation, and they didn't even recognize that these were
Catholic Christians.
Catholic Christians. They felt maybe they're sort of schismatic too, and they immediately insisted, if you really want to be Catholic, you have to be Catholic in the Portuguese and Spanish way. They burnt their liturgical books. They insisted that they follow the Western practices, and it was a very painful thing. In fact, some of them endured it, which are the Syro-Malabar Christians, and others, over this, what we call Latinization, broke away. And they were like orphans, and finally they got the Syrian Orthodox Patriarch of Damascus to take them under his wing. So that's why part of that church now is Orthodox, and the other part remains Catholic.
Well, that's I had known that. I knew about the 2 groups, but I didn't know what the origins of it was. But Monsignor, they're not treated like this now, are they, Monsignor Faris?
Well, in the 16th century, what they had to do was to decide when these groups were coming back to Catholicism in small groups. For example, with the Coptics or the Armenians. Well, they had to decide right away, well, if you became Catholic, did you have to be a Latin Catholic? And the Holy See very wisely at that point said, no, you can retain your Eastern traditions and be in full communion with Rome. That's where we speak of Eastern Catholic churches today.
And this goes back to a decision in the 16th century.
16th and 17th century when they were coming back to Rome. Now, there was a great deal of Latinization in the Syro-Malabar Church and in the Maronite Church. There was a great deal of, partly because the people, their books were burnt on some occasions, and they weren't aware of the richness of their own tradition. They felt somewhat inferior. Another reason was that the missionaries sent very intelligent young men to Rome to study. They came back to be bishops in these territories, and unfortunately they had studied Latin theology and liturgy, and that's what they imposed on the people. We always say it was the Latinization by the Latin Church, at the very beginning perhaps, but the Latinizations that occurred later were at the hands of our own bishops and priests educated elsewhere. Today, with this Holy Father and also with Pope Paul VI, who initiated it, it even went back further to Leo XIII.
In the late 19th century.
In the late 19th century with the 1895 document Orientalium Dignitas, who emphasized the value of these Eastern rites and the importance to return to their original roots. And that has been encouraged and almost imposed at times by Rome.
So now almost the opposite movement.
And what's happened is that the understanding of the ecumenical movement, the union of the church, has shifted ground radically. See, in those centuries, it was mostly individuals and small groups who would join Rome and therefore be ostracized by their local church. Mm-hmm. And you ended up with a sort of a third kind of church. It wasn't the Eastern Orthodox, and it wasn't the Roman Catholic. It was a Catholic bridge to the Eastern Orthodox. Now, especially with the leadership of Pope John Paul II, the emphasis is more on the relationship between the large Orthodox Eastern Church and the Western Church. Mm-hmm. It's no longer an emphasis on trying to get one by one people, so to speak, shifting sides, but to get a growing closer together of the whole large church. So in fact, ecumenical relations now are a three-way affair. It's the Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the little Eastern Catholic churches all coming together.
Now, who would represent, if the Holy Father wants to reach out to the Eastern churches, who represents them? Who does he talk to?
Well, they're all separate churches, like Monsignor Faris said at the beginning, so he has to talk to many heads of churches. Some are tiny, for example, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem is a very, very tiny patriarchate, but it's considered a totally autonomous church. On the other hand, Patriarch Alexei of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow, perhaps traditionally has 60, 70 million persons under him.
Now, what about the Patriarch of Constantinople? You hear you hear of him all the time as sort of the head of the Eastern Church.
Well, he's the
what do you mean by that?
In some sense, he's the first of that family of churches that used to be under Constantinople. There's really two groups of Eastern churches. Sometimes they say the Oriental Orthodox churches and then the Byzantine Orthodox churches. So the Patriarch of Constantinople is, so to speak, the first of the patriarchs of that Byzantine family, even though his own jurisdiction has hardly any people at all.
Where is it?
He's in Istanbul. His own immediate faithful there are just a handful.
Istanbul, Turkey. So that's
right.
Mostly Muslim now, but that had been the great center of Eastern Catholicism.
Exactly. Now, the biggest part of the Patriarch's Church would be in North and South America. Archbishop Yakovos in New York City, for many years, has been the head of the Greek Orthodox Diocese of North and South America. And he would be directly under the Patriarch.
Of Constantinople.
Of Constantinople.
Fascinating. Well, we'll continue this discussion when we come back from this break.
Even the discussion gets...
The St. Charles Forum will continue in a moment.
Welcome back to the St. Charles Forum as we discuss Christians in the Middle East. Monsignor Faris made an interesting point during the break that there are some Christians there who still worship in the language of Christ.
Yes, in the Maronite Church, in the Syrian Catholic Church, in the Jacobite Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, they still use as the liturgical language Syriac, which is the language of a form of the language that Christ himself spoke. This language, as I told you, spread to China, and even though the churches had disappeared,
the missionaries took it to China.
Yes, the missionaries took it to China. And when the Jesuits went there in the 16th century, the churches had disappeared, but the people said, yes, we know these prayers, and they recited the Our Father in Syriac.
There's still some little villages that speak the language. 2 months ago, I was in Syria visiting the village of Malula. Malula is one of 3 villages that still speaks the old Syriac, or Aramaic, as the local tongue. Right. The other 2 villages are Muslim. Over the centuries, they had become Muslim, but they still retained Aramaic. They're Aramaic-speaking Muslims, and in Malula, they are Aramaic-speaking Christians.
And obviously trace their roots back.
All the way.
Yeah,
all the way.
Fascinating.
We were recently at the installation of the Syrian Orthodox bishop.
Yeah, we
were both attending, there. And I was amazed at how the people, our people don't know as much, but how the people sang the songs and recited the prayers in Syriac with great facility.
Well, that's a beautiful living link with the past, and It's wonderful to have it in our church. But we've been talking about the fact that the whole region was Catholic at one time, Christian, and now it's almost entirely Muslim, Islamic, and we trace that back to the great expansion of Islam. But if we read the papers today, we see that there's a resurgence of what's called Islamic fundamentalism. Monsignor, can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what its significance is for the Christians?
Well, when you say fundamentalism, as Christians, it connotes something. We think of Christian fundamentalists, meaning people who take the Bible very, very literally and reject a lot of modern interpretations. But Islamic fundamentalism, I think, has much more of a political tone to it in addition to the religious. It's a movement of asserting one's identity. And I think so many of the countries feel overwhelmed by the West and its culture and its values, and they want to reassert theirs. And in a sense, they want to have an independence too, and they want to reject what they feel are a lot of corrupt regimes. So it's a mixture of, I think, of nationalism, of political factors internal to the country, and Islam.
It can sometimes be quite militant.
Yes, and in a sense that betrays the nature of Islam. Most people are beginning to associate Islam with violence and death. Well, that's just as much condemned by the teaching of Muhammad and the holy book of the Muslims as it is by the teaching of Jesus and the holy books of the Christians. Mm-hmm.
So I just read in the New York Times that a group of Coptic Christians had been killed by Islamic fundamentalists.
That's right.
But generally, I mean, you hear this movement, this militant movement, and as you say, it may be betraying the tenets of Islam, but nonetheless, it's a very dominant movement over there in the Middle East right now. Does this pose a threat to the Christian community that's left in the Middle East?
Oh, a violent threat, yes, because one of the targets for the fundamentalists, this so-called Islamic fundamentalists, are the Christians and the foreigners and what they feel are corrupt and westernized regimes of their own countries. So Egypt, there are many villages in Egypt where Orthodox Christians and Muslims have lived peaceably for centuries. And now there's a deliberate, provocative moves by these extremists to try to provoke hatred, violence, attacks on simple people in the villages.
Is that a problem in Lebanon at all?
Very much so. That was the reason for the 1975 Civil War. It's unfortunate that all of a sudden, fundamentalism, Islamic, it's all together, and fanaticism, that all those words are used together. Because as Monsignor mentioned, for centuries in Lebanon, Muslims and Christians and Druze lived side by side in the same villages peacefully. There's a militant element now growing in the Middle East. Not all Muslims are this way. It's a certain element of fanaticism that are threatening not only Christians, but the very stability of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I think that not only Christianity is threatened in Egypt, for example, but also the very government of Mubarak, because, again, it's a fanaticism.
But we should be keeping our fellow Christians very much in our prayers then as they go through this period.
And Monsignor's far too modest to mention this, but the Holy Father, the Vatican has an agency, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, that is concerned with just these issues, and not only praying for these people, which we must do every day, but also providing a great deal of material support to various endeavors in the Middle East, and that's
Well, I do want to find out more about the organization. I'm sure our people do. You're the general secretary of a papal agency, is that correct?
It's a papal agency, yeah.
Known as the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what it's attempting to do?
Well, it was founded by Pope Pius XI in 1926, and since there was a great deal of interest in the Middle East in the U.S. at that time, curiously enough, it was entrusted to the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, and that has continued over the years.
Oh.
So it's a papal agency, but its primary office is in New York City, although we have an office in the Vatican and in other parts of the world. And its first mission is to support all of the works and institutions of the Catholic Eastern churches. It also is to provide humanitarian assistance in their homelands. And it's another very important objective is to work for the union of all the Eastern churches with the Holy See.
Oh, that's one of your objectives.
One of
It's
the
not
primary
just,
objectives.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. I mean, frankly, in all honesty, I had always associated it with providing material assistance and, I mean, very good works, but more the charitable corporate acts of mercy.
Well, sometimes that's the way we do it. The Holy Father likes to speak sometimes about religious dialogue, and he talks about theological dialogue and the dialogue of charity or love. And I think we are not part of the theological dialogue. That's a matter for the theologians, the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. But we're very much part of the dialogue of charity and love.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
In other words, we try to work with all of the churches. In fact, I tell my staff as a sort of operating principle, act as though the church is one. Unless so, we pay the same respect to the Orthodox patriarchs and bishops as we would to the Catholic patriarchs and bishops. If their needs are greater, we help them. If our own people's needs are greater, we help them. We try to help both.
And where do you get the resources for this wonderful work?
Mostly through individual contributions, by mail, actually. That's our main source of, of income. Yeah.
And so in that sense, you're a U.S. corporation, a nonprofit U.S. corporation that can receive tax-deductible contributions.
Yes, a religious corporation, actually, New York State Religious Corporation.
Oh, New York State Religious Corporation. Yeah. And you have a publication as well, which I've seen is quite handsome.
Thank you. It's a small magazine that comes out twice a month called Catholic Near East, and the objective of the magazine is to teach people about the Eastern churches, Catholic and Orthodox, about other religions in the region, about the cultures and history. And in a sense, it occupies a sort of a unique niche because I don't think we have any competitors at the task of trying to educate people about the Middle East.
And it's so varied and so fascinating. I mean, the types of churches in the East. There are those out there in the theological community now that are crying for more pluralism, that they think there ought to be different ways in which the faith ought to be expressed. But both of you, reverend gentlemen, are showing us that there's an ancient, venerable pluralism that's already out there and that doesn't depart on the truths of theology. Right?
It's a funny example, but it's like potatoes.
Okay, you'll have to explain that one to me.
Well, they say, for example, that the homeland of the potato, not Ireland, but it was Peru in the Altiplano. And there are people now concerned to maintain the immense variety in the genetic stock of potatoes that exists, say, in the Altiplano, because we've favored one or two kinds almost to the exclusion of everything else. It's like delicious apples, for example. They're the main ones you see in the market. Well, the churches are like that. We have so been dominated by the Roman or Latin form of Christianity that we're forgetting the tremendous pool of richness of liturgy and theology and asceticism and popular devotion in all the other branches of the church. And I think that even though most people don't know about it, it's a great concern of the Holy Father that they should be maintained and supported and be part of the mix that makes the worldwide church what it really is.
And that's a true pluralism.
Yes. Yeah.
Msgr. Faris, you were saying that we have the Maronite rite. Now, I have to admit that usually when we hear about the Byzantine rite or the Maronite rite, we think of the liturgy, the ritual, the rite that's being celebrated. But you understand it in a far broader way than that, don't you?
Yes. Well, first of all, we are members of a Maronite church, to be very technical.
Mm-hmm.
Canon lawyers are like that.
Yeah, you are a canon lawyer as well. Yes.
So we are members of a church, the Maronite Church, and we follow a rite, one of the 21 Eastern rites. And a rite does not simply comprehend the liturgy, but as Monsignor said, the ascetic life, the discipline, the way we carry out Christian life, the spirituality, the music. So a rite is really a body of tradition on a specific way in which the Catholic faith is manifested.
Is lived out.
Is lived out.
And it's, as you say, it's much broader than just the liturgy.
Just the liturgy itself, precisely. Exactly. And much broader than we kind of think of it as a national issue or an ethnic issue or a language. I was telling you at one time during lunch that I am half Irish, half Lebanese, but fully Maronite. Mm-hmm. That you don't have to be Lebanese or Syrian or Middle Eastern to be Maronite. And the Eastern churches have a role to play here in the United States of evangelizing.
By the way, I think I can do one better because I'm half Irish and half German Jewish and fully Catholic.
Fully Catholic. Thanks be to God. We've all been called to that life. We have to close out this segment soon, but there have been developments in the Middle East with regard to a joint Christian statement on the status of Jerusalem. Msgr, maybe we could finish out this segment. You could explain the Christian concerns about Jerusalem.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, there are not many Christians left in Jerusalem or in the Holy Land, but the ones who are there are deeply conscious of their roots because they are from the beginning. And Jerusalem, for example, has three major leaders, three patriarchs: the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, the Armenian Patriarch, and the Latin or the Roman Catholic Patriarch. It also has a Syrian Orthodox bishop and an Ethiopian Orthodox bishop and a Coptic Orthodox bishop and an Anglican bishop. So there are a lot of church leaders there. And thanks be to God for the political situation has pressed them more and more together. And increasingly they're speaking with a common voice about the future of the Holy Land. And one of the things they're saying about Jerusalem is it isn't just the question is the UN declaration of an international city or the Israeli claim for the Jewish capital or the Palestinian claim for their capital. They said the status of Jerusalem has to involve the churches that have grown from Jerusalem. Jerusalem, so to speak, is the spiritual capital of half the human race, Jews and Muslims.
But right
and
now, technically, it's controlled by the Israelis. Is
yes,
that correct?
It's controlled by the Israelis. Curiously, by international law, that's not recognized.
Okay.
There's hardly any country in the world that recognizes the claim because technically the UN says it's an international city.
Well, we're going to have, this is so fascinating, we're going to pick it up a little bit more when we come back from this break.
The St. Charles Forum will continue in a moment.
Welcome back to our discussion of Christians in the East. We concluded the last segment talking about Jerusalem, really didn't quite finish it. Monsignor, you were saying that the Christians in the area are very concerned about the status of Jerusalem, that it currently now politically it's in control of the Israelis, although that's contravening international law right now. But maybe we can just finish that up in terms of clarifying the status of Jerusalem, what the concerns of the Christians there is.
I think the Holy See properly says the political solution to Jerusalem is not our business, so to speak, but they're concerned that the spiritual significance of the city, the fact that it's a major holy place for the three great monotheistic religions, be properly safeguarded. And
how would that be done? How could you safeguard that?
They speak of the idea of some type of international guarantees. The Israelis find that a little offensive because they say we are safeguarding the character of the city. But there are things, for example, that represent the Israeli national interest which can overrule that. A good example would be right now, in reaction to the terrible things that took place in Israel recently, Jerusalem, so to speak, is totally shut off from the communities around it, which belong to the West Bank and the Palestinian areas.
This was because of bombings that had taken place.
Yes, and it had been pretty much
Jerusalem.
closed off for the past 2.5, 3 years anyway. So, for example, when I was visiting the rector of the seminary, living in Beit Jala, which is part of Bethlehem, he's about 3 or 4 mile trip to the old city of Jerusalem. This Catholic priest is the rector of the seminary. He's not allowed to do it. If he wants to meet the bishop has to come to Bethlehem because he lives in the occupied area, the Palestinian area, and he's not allowed to enter Jerusalem.
By the Israeli authorities?
Yes.
Yeah.
What is the reason? Is it any discrimination against religion? Of course not. It's a preoccupation for the security of the city. But it overrides, so to speak, the access to the holy places.
So this
for the
is one of the
local
things that the Christians in the region, the Christian leaders are concerned about, and why they would like to see it under some kind of international control or supervision or
I think
oversight
assurances.
Okay.
And I guess another concern is that the presence of the church is more than just the presence of the shrines. The church is a people, and therefore there must be a Christian living community, and therefore there has to be economic opportunity and housing and a role for them in the civil society.
Now, there is some danger, isn't there, that Christianity as a lived religion will survive in certain areas of the Middle East?
Yeah, very much so.
What,
You look at North Africa, which once was almost entirely Christian. There's hardly any Christians left at all. And in some sense, that is happening already in the Middle East. It's not a possible future. If we don't arrest the trend, it's happening now.
What's the condition of the Christians, let's say, in Lebanon? Is it not too good?
I would say threatened.
Threatened.
I would say threatened. In many countries in the Middle East, Christians are treated as second-class citizens, as controlled in some way. They can move in society, work in society, and sometimes prosper, but are quite often controlled in Islamic countries. But I have to balance that off with something else. Experience tells us, we have proof, that Christians and Muslims and Jews can live together. It is people, external forces quite often, who don't want that to happen for a variety of reasons and play one against the other. In Lebanon, fanatic Islam, not Muslim, not Islam in its basic, beautiful sense of the word, but fanatic Muslims have threatened Christians with the sword or the sea. Either you die or you flee, that they're going to create a totalitarian Islamic state. That does neither justice to Islam nor to the Christians themselves. We have to be careful that, as I said in the first segment, if we're not careful, the land where Christ himself walked will no longer praise his name.
Well, is there any way in which American citizens can prevail upon their government?
I do have something, yes.
Yeah.
This is my own political plug. We have negotiations going on right now in the Middle East regarding the process, the peace process. It's mainly now centering on Syria's place in the process and its relationship to Israel. We have to be careful as American citizens that Lebanon is not the price paid for peace, that it's not the pawn used to appease any one country. That will do violence to a society that is an example of what we want in the Middle East, of pluralism.
Mm-hmm. So, you're saying this because the Syrians are, to a large extent, in control, right, in Lebanon.
They are occupying forces at this point. There are many occupying forces. There are Shiite Iranians there. There are Israeli forces to the south. And there are Syrian soldiers.
Well, it must have been terribly difficult for the Christians in Iraq. I understand there's a sizable Christian community in Iraq. At the time of the Gulf War, where you had virtually, all the Western nations allied against what was seen as an aggression by Iraq against Kuwait. Did that not leave the Christians there in a very awkward, difficult, tenuous position?
They shared the suffering. Just a vignette, I was in Baghdad, and the Apostolic Nuncio, the Holy Father's representative, took us to the roof of his building and pointed one block away, and he said that's where one of the American smart bombs totally demolished, a communication center. So, sure, the church in Iraq was there in the midst of the war, and the Christians in the midst of the war, and suffering ever since. That the embargo, for example, leaves the average Iraqi destitute. In fact, one of the works our agency does is a very small scale, but try to get, over the years, convoys of food and medicine from Amman, Jordan, into Baghdad and to Mosul in the north, bring medicines to the Catholic hospitals, and work through the local network of the church to help the people.
Where would you see the greatest hope for the church in that general region? What community seems to be the most vibrant that might be able to provide locally support to other Christian communities?
That's a difficult question. Lebanon, as Monsignor said, one of the great things about Lebanon, it's an Arab country that, in spite of all of the weaknesses there of the political scene, has entertained pluralism. Where Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, Druze, and various kinds of Christians
had lived together in peace.
Have lived together and still have a formula for how to live together. And that's good. It's the only country where, at the moment, where it's possible. In every other country, as Monsignor said, the Christian is definitely a second-class citizen.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, and there's still so many fascinating things to discuss here. Can you tell us a little bit about the relations between the Christians and, let's say, I don't want to say good or bad Muslims, but let's say Islam at its best and Christianity at its best? Where do we find some kind of rapprochement there?
Well, I think it's like everything else. The headline is always the bad news. The good news is quiet and behind the scenes. If I could give you a personal example, the Grand Mufti of Syria, which is the principal Islamic teacher, the sheikh, the head of the church, so to speak, in Syria, Sheikh Ahmed Kaftaro, is an old man whose whole life is dedicated towards brotherhood between Christians and Muslims. About a year or so ago, I was a special guest at his mosque in Damascus on Friday at the 12 noon service, the main service. And the whole teaching that the sheikh gave, his sermon, we would say, was, as we look at all of the problems of the modern world, the believers in the one God must be in total solidarity. And he said, the followers of Moses, the followers of Jesus, and the followers of Muhammad. And his whole sermon was about that. He talked about in the Quran, for example, the only woman mentioned in the Quran is Mary, the mother of our Lord. And he spoke with the same reverence about Jesus and Muhammad. He would say, our Lord Jesus, may peace be upon him. Our Lord Muhammad, may peace be upon him. He told an anecdote of how the Prophet Muhammad had to confront a Muslim accusing a Jew and was prompt to believe the Muslim. And God revealed to him that the Jew was the man of integrity and the Muslim lied. He berated his people. He said, you all call yourselves Muslim, but a Muslim is one who does God's will. And there are many who don't call themselves Muslim who are true Muslims. And many who say they are Muslims and are not. Well, now this is a major teacher of Islam, and yet his whole thrust is that we must be in solidarity. By the way, at the end of that sermon, he invited me to speak to his people in the mosque, which was extraordinary. About 5,000 believers.
My goodness, that is
in
remarkable.
one of the principal mosques of Damascus, and here a Catholic priest speaking to them. And I tried, of course, to echo the same vein. That's going on all over, because the good Muslim and the good Christian should no more be fighting each other than the Catholics and Protestants should be in Ireland. I mean, it's labels, but it's not the integrity of the doctrine.
Well, the Holy Father has, in a sense, been saying the same thing. That is, those who worship the one God must come together against the atheistic or agnostic movements, the materialism of the modern world. And it's only in faith that we're going to be able to counter those evil effects.
Recently, the Holy Father had a synod for Lebanon in Rome, which he personally attended all of the sessions, sat there each day, and at the sessions were non-Catholic representatives from the Orthodox and Protestant denominations, and also Muslim observers, which he referred to as fraternal observers, because it's absolutely essential that there be cooperation and understanding in this area.
Well, and for the sheer existence of the church too. Now, I mean,
Yes.
Obviously, it's done because we do recognize their dignity, but also for the survival of Christianity in that region. We're speaking of our Holy Father. We know that he is calling us to renewal in anticipation of the third millennium. I know that he wants to go to the Holy Land. Maybe we can just finish up this our fascinating discussion with you two gentlemen reflecting on what you think of the possibilities for the Holy Father getting to the Holy Land and what you see as the future.
I think if it depends on him, he's going to be there. I think if anybody in the world wants Pope John Paul II in Jerusalem at the millennium, it's Pope John Paul II.
Yeah.
And it would be a wonderful sign for the entire region and the world.
What are some of the
sign of
principal
hope.
obstacles, though, that must be overcome before he could do that?
Security.
Security.
Security,
Yes,
probably.
Politics. His very presence can be construed as an endorsement of a political situation one way or another.
If he just happens to find himself in one piece of territory as opposed to another.
But the peace process is going on, and if it goes on in a positive way, that's just to all the parties concerned, it's quite possible.
Yes.
We have to pray for that. That's something we have to pray.
Well, and he did shortly after he became Pope go right away to Istanbul, didn't he?
He did.
To reach out to the Byzantine Church.
And he has a wonderful precedent because Pope Paul VI, shortly after he became Pope, did go to the Holy Land.
Oh,
in spite of
that's
everything.
right.
Yes.
And no one has ever forgotten his visit there.
And so you have the Christian virtue of hope, right? And in anticipation of the future. Well, we thank you so much for being with us. I know that our viewers will be anxious to learn even more about your work, Msgr, in the Middle East, and we'll make sure that they're able to get the address of the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. But I thank both of you very much for being with us. We will pray for peace in Jerusalem. And we thank our viewers for joining us on this episode of the St. Charles Forum.